Hello, my name is Cindy Stout, and I am here to welcome you to our Tuesday evening keynote, the first live keynote of TLD. Before we get started, I've got a couple reminders for you. Don't forget to be involved in the TLD Goose Chase for a fun and engaging way to extend your learning at TLD. You have till the end of the day on Friday to win one of the prizes, so good luck. Remember that in addition to the sessions on the agenda, we have a ton of resource posters from TPS partners across the country. These can be accessed under the posters link under the agenda section. As a reminder, we'll send out contact hours and hour forms and surveys at the end of the week. Answer the polling questions if you have any ideas for using the ideas from this presentation in your classroom. Please remember to utilize the question and answer and chat options on Whova to interact with our speaker throughout his presentation. And if you just put it on chat, and then someone will ask the questions for you. And it is my great pleasure and my great honor to introduce Professor William Wei, who is a professor of history at CU in modern Chinese history, Asian American history, Colorado history, and is the senior Asianist in CU's Department of History. From 2019 to 2020, he was the state historian. He is the editor-in-chief, and let me tell you, the chief of the Colorado Encyclopedia. His book, Asians in Colorado, Persecution and Perseverance in the Centennial State, was selected as a finalist for the 2017 50 Books to Understand the West award. To Understand the West. The most recent book, Becoming Colorado. I don't know how to do this. Wait. There. Michelle has 5 copies. The Centennial State in 100 Objects. And currently he is working on a book-length study titled Hong Kong Since the Handover, A History of Protests. So, Dr. Wei, take it away.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I'm delighted to see all of you. I'm glad we're visiting with each other on Zoom. I'd hate to think that we would be trudging through the Arctic weather to get together. When I opened the door and got an Arctic breeze, it reminded me of the movie The Day After Tomorrow, when, of course, climate change had essentially brought in or ushered in a new ice age. In any case, it's great to see you all. Great to see you all. And I'm going to be talking to you, as you know, about the subject of who's an American. Before I present my talk, I want to give each of you an opportunity to answer the question that I have posed. Who's an American? So if you will indulge me, I would appreciate it if you take a minute to write down your answer to the question of who's an American. After my talk, some of us can exchange our answers to the question. So if you'll do that for me, it'd be much appreciated. I understand if you want, you can even share it on chat, but you don't have to. You can wait until the end of the talk to share it with the assembled group. Well, it looks like at least of the three people that I can see on the screen, you've had a chance to answer the question. How about the rest of you folks? Do you need, as we say in class, right? Do you need more time? If so, we'd be delighted to give you another minute. Oh, I see. One person has already put her answer on the chat. Okay, great answer. We'll have a chance to to share that answer along with others at the end of my talk. By the way, in my role as, well, the person, I guess, making the presentation, I get to be the devil's advocate, which means I get to interrogate you about the answers that you have provided. I thought I should warn you of that. Okay. Okay. If it's all right with you, I'm going to begin talking to you about who's an American. And the reason I had you answer this question is that it is a, well, a timely question. In recent years, it has been raised implicitly as the country grappled with the question of who should be allowed to immigrate to the United States. During last week's Winter Olympics in Beijing, it was raised again when some folks questioned the nationality of some of our Asian American athletes. Some of you may have read the story about Christy Yamaguchi, who won a gold medal 30 years ago for figure skating at the Albertville Winter Olympics. Yamaguchi had finished ahead of two Japanese skaters. She was anxious to participate in the medal ceremony, sing our national anthem, but it was delayed because they could not find 3 Japanese flags. Yamaguchi remembers telling someone, "Can someone tell them I am an American?" One of the things that has stayed with me all these years is that you could tell she was a young woman from California when compared to her rival Midori Ito from Japan. All you had to do was listen to her speak. The problem is Asian Americans are often taken at face value. And this is a recurring problem. Since its inception, America has wrestled with the perennial question of who's an American. It is a question about who belongs in the United States. It is often answered by the laws enacted to allow select groups of people to enter the country, and in some cases, to exclude specific groups from the country. It is a question about who can become a citizen of the United States. It is answered by laws enacted to allow select types of people to become citizens, and in some cases, to prevent specific kinds of people from being citizens, and to deprive them of the rights and protections that American citizens enjoy. Essentially, it is a question of who can enjoy the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which, as you know, is specified in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. They are words that bear repeating, so I'm going to repeat them. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Most of us know these words by heart and have probably repeated them on more than one occasion. These words encapsulate the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence. They represent the promise. I repeat, they represent the promise we made when establishing America. And the US Constitution was supposed to be how the promise was to be fulfilled. Together, these documents serve as the basis of the American state and society. These words have inspired people to immigrate to America and inspired people of color in America to defend the country when its enemies, domestic and foreign, have threatened it, even though they have been discriminated against. All have believed that the country will keep its promise, if not to them, then to their descendants, that someday they will be regarded as full-fledged Americans. Now, while all people are endowed with these unalienable rights, the government, the American government, is responsible for protecting these rights among the people. However, as we all know, the government's record of protecting these rights has been, well, a mixed one. Since the establishment of the United States, there has been a struggle between those who have sought to realize these rights for all Americans and those who have sought to limit them to an exclusive group of Americans. This struggle is a constant one, and I dare say will persist into the future. It is part and parcel of our unreconciled past and contested future. It is little wonder that some people say we Americans suffer from cognitive dissonance, since we struggle to resolve the contradiction between our belief that all people are created equal and are endowed with these unalienable rights, and the reality of inequality and the denial of these rights to specific groups of people. In denying people equality and rights, one group seeks to subordinate another group of people. Historically, this has been mainly white men who have sought to keep others, people of color, women, members of the LGBTQ community, and others in a subordinate position. They have done so to perpetuate white male supremacy. They have built a hierarchical system based on the erroneous idea that certain people are innately inferior. They have justified this by considering some people as less than human and even non-human, particularly people of color. They have created demeaning stereotypes to justify these assumptions of inferiority, making racism palatable. While these unalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness can never be annulled, they can be obstructed by unjust laws. Unfortunately, this began with the establishment of the Republic. The realization of the ideals embodied in the Declaration of Independence was, well, hampered by the US Constitution, which, as you all know, is the highest law of the land. The US Constitution failed to specify who was an American, who belonged in America. It was more concerned about limiting government to protect people's freedom and to establish a functional government. To do so, the founding fathers engaged in political compromises that betrayed 1/5 of the people living in the American colonies at the time, enslaved Blacks. This was America's original sin. It led to the Civil War, which was America's bloodiest conflict. According to some historians, demographic historians, it resulted in 750,000 American deaths, more casualties in the Civil War than the other wars that we have fought. This original sin has been the source of racial strife and has led to accusations of hypocrisy ever since. From the country's inception until the Civil War, America was considered a predominantly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation, and Americans were defined as mainly racially white. Now, over time, the idea of white expanded to encompass other European ethnic groups, such as Celts and Teutonics, and other religions, such as Catholicism. By the way, how many of you trace your part of your ancestry to some group other than, white Anglo-Saxon? Oh, would any of you, besides Michelle, who's always prepared to participate, any of the rest of you trace your ancestry to some group besides white Anglo-Saxon Protestants? Can you, for the purposes of today's discussion, can you raise your hand? I guess you'll have to raise your hand virtually. Oh, the rest of you all belong to the category of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant? Wow, that's pretty neat. That usually doesn't happen. Although I can tell by looking at the names that that's not quite true. Well, in any case, the point of the exercise is that at an earlier point in time, you or your ancestor would not have been considered an American, not in the truest sense, at least until they began to expand the definition of who could be included. As I pointed out, Celts, which refers to the Irish, Teutonics, the Germans, and other religions such as Catholicism. For those of you who are familiar with American nativism, you know that one of the groups that were considered anathema in America were those who practice the Catholic faith. Right? Okay. Since the Civil War, America has been increasingly diverse. The expression, "we the people of the United States," that begins the Constitution now refers to an inclusive society consisting of people committed to the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Though a historian not given to predictions, I am confident that white supremacy will eventually give way to racial pluralism because of the inevitable demographic changes that will occur. The US is projected to become a majority-minority nation for the first time in 2043. While the non-Hispanic white population will remain the largest single group, no group will make up a majority. All in all, minorities, now 37% of the US population, are projected to comprise 57% of the population in 2060. This inevitability has led to anxieties among the white majority, who fear the loss of their racially based power and privileges. They fear that they and their descendants will be treated the way they have treated people of color. And quite frankly, that scares the heck out of them. In an act of desperation, some whites have portrayed themselves as victims of racism, which quite frankly is patently absurd. They have disregarded the country's history of racial exclusion and marginalization that has given them a monopoly on wealth and power. To argue that, well, anything that erodes their advantage is racist. In other words, offering people of color the privileges that whites have always enjoyed from birth is somehow discriminating against them. In US history, the federal and state governments have enacted many laws to keep people of color in a subordinate position, relegated them to the margins of society, and even physically separate by confining them to plantations, reservations, and ghettos. That's basically what we have done historically to people we don't like, the people that we're afraid of. The federal and state governments have also abrogated these unjust laws and have enacted laws to counter them. And that's important to remember. American civics should be in part about these laws, all of them, as part of the evaluation of our ongoing effort to make these United States a, well, more perfect union, which is, after all, what the American project has been about. So let's discuss some of the most significant laws enacted since the Civil War to define an American. Perhaps the first ones to highlight are the 3 Civil War amendments that were ratified to correct the flaws in the US Constitution. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, designed to ensure equality before the law, and the 15th Amendment, which barred discrimination in voting on account of race. With the removal of federal troops from the South in 1877, the enforcement of Reconstruction era policies ended. The Southern legislatures undermined the Black progress achieved during Reconstruction by enacting local laws that ushered in the Jim Crow era of racial segregation. Blacks were reduced to second-class citizens and disenfranchised through various voter suppression measures. It would take another century, about a century, before legal segregation ended with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and voter suppression ended with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As you know, this past year, there has been a renewed effort to engage in voter suppression in certain places in the country. Another set of significant laws that sought to define who could be an American were immigration laws. Initially, immigrants were generally welcome, and the country had a free immigration policy. After forcibly removing the indigenous peoples from the land, we needed people, those whom we deemed to be the right sort of people, to inhabit it. During the post-Civil War period, the US Congress began to limit immigration, and the country's immigration policy became increasingly selective and restrictive. In other words, the US Congress passed laws excluding certain groups from entering the country to become citizens. Asians were the first to be excluded from the country, beginning with the Chinese Exclusion Act, and later the Gentleman's Agreement that kept the Japanese from immigrating to the United States. Oh, not incidentally, the Chinese Exclusion Act also declared Chinese ineligible for citizenship. Believing that immigrants from Northern and Western Europe were superior to Southern and Eastern Europe, the US Congress began discriminating against Southern and Eastern European immigrants after World War I. In 1924, Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Act that established national quotas of 2% of the number living here in 1890 and excluded all Asians from entering the country. But this is, as you know, a back and forth experience. So fortunately, in 1965, the Hart-Celler Act was passed that eliminated the basic discriminatory features of US immigration policy. It repealed the quota system and established preference categories to attract people with talents and skills needed in American society. It had a policy of family reunification to allow family members of immigrants already in the United States to enter the country outside of the admission ceilings. Those were 170,000 from outside the Western Hemisphere and 20,000 from any one country. Under the Trump administration, there were, as you know, efforts to reduce the number and types of immigrants allowed to enter the country once again. As most of you will recall, when discussing immigration, Trump asked why America would want immigrants from so-called shithole countries, such as Haiti and Africa. And America should have more people coming from places like Norway. Actually, if he said it in the context of the Olympic Games, we could almost understand why he'd want more people from Norway, right? The third set of laws that sought to define who could be an American was naturalization laws. Defining America as a white nation was made manifest by enacting the country's first immigration law, the Naturalization Act of 1790, 3 years after writing the US Constitution. The law limited naturalization to free white persons of good character, thus excluding Native Americans, indentured servants, enslaved people, free Black people, and later Asians. Although free Black people were allowed citizenship at the state level in certain states. Perhaps the first thing to note is that the Constitution and the previously mentioned amendments conflict with federal naturalization laws, making race, not the place of birth, the touchstone of naturalization. The 14th Amendment corrected this, saying that all persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States, even if born to parents who themselves are ineligible for citizenship. The US Supreme Court affirmed this point in the case of the United States versus Wong Kim Ok in 1898. In other words, it ratified the citizenship of second-generation Chinese Americans. Still, there have been persistent efforts to legislate the end of birthright citizenship, especially for those whose parents are illegal immigrants or based on the national origin of a child's ancestors. Some folks want racial identity, specifically those belonging to the white race, to be the only ones eligible for US citizenship. For those of you who study European history, that is reminiscent of the Nuremberg laws in 1935 by the Nazis. In the early 20th century, policymakers and judges drew a color line between eligible and ineligible aliens. This was the case with Asian immigrants, illustrated by the Ozawa versus United States and the Thin versus United States cases. In the Ozawa versus United States, this was in 1922, the US Supreme Court decided that even though Ozawa Takao was an upstanding 20-year-old resident of the United States, he was ineligible for citizenship and denied his application of naturalization, saying the intention was to confer the privilege of citizenship upon that class of persons whom the fathers knew as white, and to deny it to all who cannot be so classified. And then contradicting the logic behind the Ozawa versus US case was the US versus Bhagat Singh Thind. He too was found ineligible for citizenship, even though as an Asian Indian, he would have been categorized as Aryan or Caucasian, according to the prevailing racial science of the time. Although Thind was technically white, the Supreme Court found that he was not considered white in the eyes of the common man, despite scientific race categories, and was therefore also ineligible for citizenship. Not incidentally, the Thind decision led to the denaturalization of about 50 Asian Indian Americans who had successfully applied for and received US citizenship earlier. Though contradictory and confusing, one thing is clear. In the early 20th century, America's naturalization policy favored whites, however you defined them, or rather, however they defined them. After World War II and our victory against the Axis powers of Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and militaristic Japan, and the start of the Cold War, the United States reversed its restrictive naturalization policy with the passage of the McCarran-Walter Act. The United States had an egalitarian naturalization policy that did not discriminate based on race, nationality, or sex. Individual qualifications became the basis for American citizenship. So, in conclusion, I'd like to discuss with you the question posed at the beginning of this talk: who's an American? I have my own answer to the question, which I will share with you shortly, but I'd like to to learn what the rest of you have said. Would any of you like to share your answer? By the way, I'm faced with a lot of names, but no faces. I find this very disconcerting. I have difficulties talking to names. The people, I like people. I can talk to people. Hey, there you go. I see a few. Now, come on, you folks. You know, you're good-looking people. You should be willing to show yourselves. Okay. Hey. I see more of you. Okay. Very good. Hey, now I'm missing a few here. Now, come on, folks. You can do this. Unless you think you're in an awkward situation, you really can't reveal yourself. It's something would be great to see you, so we can talk to each other.
Yeah, and we have a small enough group here.
Okay.
I think people, if they wanted to unmute, I think you're allowed to do that. So if anybody has a question, they just want to pop on. I think that might be a good way to do that if you're okay with that, Dr. Wei.
Okay, well, why don't we just share a few of these, your answers. I'll be happy to share my answer with you, okay? And then I'll be happy to entertain any questions that you might have. What I usually say when I make these presentations is that you can't allow me to get away with what I said, right? Yeah. Okay, so excuse me, who among you would like to set an example for the rest of us and share your answer to the question of who's an American? You know, the usual, don't speak all at once.
So Dr. Wei, I'll start. How's that?
Thank you, Michelle. I knew I could count on you.
I'll be brave. You know, my answer is anybody who's here and wants to be. It goes back to what Kent had mentioned at the beginning. I think that there are multiple viewpoints at what an American is. And I think that all of us come from different backgrounds that have those different viewpoints and those perspectives in our families. Those, I think, have also changed generationally. And I know through your research and your work, you've probably seen those generational changes too. I know my grandparents had a very different perspective of what being American was than what even my parents and myself and my sons now have. So I guess I'm going to turn it back and ask you a question. As you've posed this question to others, have you seen a diverse amount of answers depending on the age or the background of the people you're working with, particularly age? Because I see a real difference in the American context depending on what generation you are. So I just wondered if you've seen that at all.
Yes, you're quite correct. And I'm pleased to report that you folks have done a good job with the young ones. Seriously, you know, you talk to the young ones in my class, young men and women, and when they learn about some of these discriminatory laws in the past, they're incredulous. You know, they can't believe we did that sort of thing. You know, they say, you know, what's up with that? You know, how could you possibly have considered these people, you know, to be, well, not American? In fact, they will say to do so is un-American. You know, and their response is natural and immediate. Not so much with the older folks, you know, who will give you reservations about why some folks, you know, should not be American. And because they will say things like, well, you know, they take, they don't give back. They take from us, they don't give back. Basically, the argument that some groups of people, you know, are by definition, you know, parasitic. And they come to take advantage of us Americans. So this is, you know, a problematic. It may be based on something they've learned, or maybe based on something they have experienced. After all, we've lived long enough, those of us here today, to have gone through cycles in which these sorts of arguments have been, you know, forwarded to explain why we shouldn't allow certain kinds of people to enter the United States, right? Even though we are, we like to say, a nation of immigrants, right? A nation of immigrants. Of course, this doesn't take into account those who are already here, the indigenous peoples. It doesn't take into account those who were forcibly brought here, you know. But apart from them, we are a nation of immigrants, but they make distinctions between good immigrants and bad immigrants, right? And perceptions of people change over time. At one point, you know, Asians were considered, as I pointed out once or twice in my remarks, as unacceptable, you know, and it's amazing the kind of stereotypical images they had of them, right? You know, disease carrying, actually, some of those images have returned. Well, disease carrying, disease promoting types of folks, right? And who should be excluded from the country. And now they often say, wow, they're great. They're a model for us all. They're model immigrants. They're the good immigrants, you know? They are in effect a model minority. And the reason they like to say that is they say, look at what we've done to these people. You know, we discriminated against them, we've excluded them, we committed violence against them. And in spite of all that, they've done well. They've been really successful. In fact, they're more successful than white folks, you know? And the implication being, if you're not successful in the United States, it's your fault. It's not because of the country and the problem of systemic racism, right? So they're making, in effect, invidious comparisons. That sort of thing goes on all the time, and goes on all the time. So in short, yes, I've seen differences between generations, but I'd like to be hopeful. You know, if teachers like yourselves continue to do the job you're doing, you know, succeeding generations of students will be incredulous about our past, and they will wonder, you know, what were you thinking? What were they thinking when they had such such laws? Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Wei. I appreciate it.
Thank you for sharing your answer. Okay, anyone else? You can either share your answers to the question of who's an American, or you can simply ask me a question, because we're in the Q&A section. Right, Keith? Kyle?
Yeah, there hasn't been any questions, but there's been a few people answering your question in the chat.
Oh, good. Okay. And so they're in the chat, are they?
Yeah, I can read them to you, or
okay, just choose one at random. Okay,
sure.
Choose one at random. Let's hear.
Okay, sure. Yeah, Keith Jones mentions, in answering the question, I think context is everything, but I think the spirit of America is, or at least should be, inclusive.
Okay, very good, Keith. I absolutely agree. Well, as a historian, I'm a great believer in keeping things in historical context. It is necessary to do so if you are to understand how and why those decisions were made. That doesn't mean you have to accept those decisions, but it certainly helps you to understand them. But I certainly also agree that the spirit of America is, or at least should be, inclusive. There's a reason why today we emphasize, right, diversity, equity, and inclusivity. Because if nothing else, it resonates with the ideals of the country.
We had something.
Yes.
We had something interesting happen today. So I am a digital coach, teacher, librarian at a middle school, and we were doing book tasting, and I had different genres and sections, but one was historical fiction. So one of the books they could choose was Code Talkers. So I book talked that a little bit, talked about it. And then in the beginning of that book, it talks about how the Native Americans had more Purple Hearts, percentage wise, more lost more people like as they served in the American military, and the kids were surprised. And I
Oh,
think often we're not telling these stories, and so for them to even learn that we won the war, I mean, that was a huge part that the Navajo Indians played. The fact that they were even willing to do that after what had happened, and then that they were still felt like it was their responsibility to be part of the military. I find that almost incredulous and kind of amazing, but it was a great discussion today with our kids, and it just made me think that we're just missing the stories, that we're not helping them understand.
yes. You just raised a good point, and that is our failure to include these stories, in our lessons about American history means that we're offering our students, well, an incomplete story, and in some respects, an inaccurate story. So it's very important, that we find the opportunities to share these stories with them. The fact of the matter is if you look at the history of various minority peoples, people of color, they often bear a disproportionate share of the responsibility in defending the country. And they've also have certainly earned, quite a number of awards for their participation in these conflicts. It's almost as if they had something to prove. Something to prove. One of my favorite examples, of course, is among the Asian Americans or the Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated in the internment camps, but nevertheless, would joined up, and they would receive, I believe, 22 Congressional Medals of Honor, which is, as you know, the highest award that can be given. And there may have been an equal number or even more earned by the Buffalo Soldiers during the 19th century, during the Indian Wars. So, and yet, you'll find that there are all kinds of characterizations or caricatures of these folks as, among other things, being unwilling to fight. The facts rarely matters to people who believe that sort of thing, right? They want to believe what they believe, and no amount of facts or the truth will dissuade them. So that's a challenge that we face. But in any case, thank you very much, Laura, for sharing that with us. Any other answers to the questions you'd like to share? Any questions you'd like to pose?
I would like to ask a question.
Yes, Mary?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Given the fairly recent uptick in culture war issues, at least on the part of one party being almost the entirety of what they talk about, and its chilling effect on schools and on school boards and on book banning and so on. I'm curious because I hadn't really considered what an impact all of that speech has on immigrant communities. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, if immigrant communities are prepared for the political battles that are coming up in the next 2 to 3 years. Any advice, I don't know, it's kind of a vague question, but I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. It's a very timely question, and thank you for asking it. Are they prepared? No, I don't think they're prepared, for the cultural wars. They're preoccupied with, with making a living. And these issues, which for some people is, quite frankly, rather abstract, may not be something that they have come to terms with. They may, when it's visited upon their children, and they have to deal with it at that point, right? At that time. I'm afraid, that that the burden actually falls, well, quite frankly, on you folks, the teachers, because you are, quite frankly, in the forefront of these culture wars, especially when it comes to, how it'll affect the children, and including the children of immigrant communities. Not only immigrant communities, well, but minority communities, whose numbers will increase over time because of the demographic changes. And you basically stand between them and those, who would, say that, well, quite frankly, they shouldn't be here, that they shouldn't be here. I mean, that's part of the cultural war argument that's being offered and things. And what are you going to do? What are you going to do? That's the question. What are you going to do about it? Because you'll be the first ones to deal with it. Let me also say that the problem, the cultural war problem, as understood in terms of, they shouldn't be here, has been around for a long time. It's not something that's new to them. Somewhere along the line, some kid is going to be told by someone, you don't belong for one reason or another. I know, I mean, it's hard. My own daughter, when she was very young, with her mother, was at the Boulder Public Library coming out, and some moron yelled at them and said, go back where you came from. Her mother was angry, didn't know quite what to say. So our daughter comes back and says, hey, Dad, this angry guy, he said to me, go back where I came from. Did he mean Boulder Community Hospital? And I said, no, sweetie, I don't think that's what he meant, but I was loath to explain to her that he didn't like you because of your ethnic background. I did what every father, every mother has done since time immemorial. I'll explain it to you a little later. I'll explain it to you when you get older. I was engaged in avoidance, but what you going to do? Fortunately, my kid, reasonably bright, figured it out on her own without my having to explain it to her, and things.
Thank you very much.
Surely. Thank you, Mary. As I said originally, you're not going to let me get away with my remarks, are you? One of the things I tell my students when I walk into class is when I come out here, I put my intellectual life on the line. And your responsibility is try to sever, if you will, that life by asking me questions. You ask me a question, I can engage in one of my monumental digressions, and tell you a story. If not, I can just share with you my answer to the question that I posed. Would you like that? Yeah, okay. Okay. Well, the answer I have to the question that I posed at the beginning of this talk, who's an American? For me, an American, now this is, remember my answer, an American is a person who is committed to realizing the American ideals of human equality and individual dignity. An American is one who believes in the words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what I believe. Those are ideals I think that are worth pursuing. That's why I think the American experiment, the American project is so important. You know, we we came up with a wonderful idea, and what we should be about is trying to realize them, in practice. And it's tough, but it has been a back and forth struggle, has it not? And it does seem that every time we, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but we persist in our efforts to try to, as I said, make this a more perfect union. I have to also confess that the last few years, I've been very discouraged. I have to say that. Last few years, I've been very discouraged, because I used to say, and I will no longer say this to my students, that we were evolving as a people, that somewhere along the line, we would eventually, in perhaps the 24th century, the age of Star Trek, we will have dealt with our problems on Earth, and that we will be very much like the Starship Enterprise, and that we will all, be part of a very diverse, equal, inclusive crew. But then I'm reminded, of course, the fact that being human beings, we will most likely need other enemies. But at least these enemies will be Cardassians, Klingons, Romulans, those extraterrestrials. We, at least on Earth, will have gotten our act together. But recently, I even wonder about that. When I do wonder about that, I basically go get a stiff drink and try to, revive my idealism. Idealism, because I believe. I know it's not fashionable to say that today that we are an exceptional country, but damn it, we are an exceptional country.
Dr. Wei, there's a question in the chat from Anne-Marie DeMars. She says, I teach a lot of workshops for kids on reservations, and when I ask them what they would most like people, or what they would most like people to know about them, they say that they are still here, that we
Yes.
are still here. How do you recommend for teachers to let their students know this when almost everything they learn about Indigenous people is in history?
Yes, yes, right. I know that's of great importance to Native Americans, to American Indians. They want people to know that they are still here, and in some cases are thriving. And that's a story that needs to be told. The only way I suspect to do that is to try to learn about, if you will, the current circumstances of Native Americans. Not just simply the past, but the current circumstances, that they are not only here, but quite active in a whole host of ways. If you can, take them to a powwow. I think that'd be great. Take them to a powwow. Well, you folks do have class visits, right? I mean, what do you call that? Field trips. You take field trips, yeah? No, you don't think, okay, scrap that, but you can certainly, learn about Native Americans today, and that includes those on reservations and those who live in the cities. Now, this doesn't mean you should ignore the problems that they are experiencing, but American society has problems abound, right? And things. But by talking about them, it very much reminds people that they are around and that they are thriving. And in some cases, their population is even growing, right? And they not only have contributed to American culture, to the American economy, to American society, to the American armed forces, as was pointed out earlier, when we talked about the Navajo Code Talkers, that they continue to contribute in other ways as well. one of the problems we have is we tend to, think of them in how we do this? We have heritage months, which I think are great. I think they're terrific. And it certainly is a good occasion to focus on one particular group and to have an in-depth discussion about their history and their culture. But the fact of the matter is we should be talking about them on a regular basis. And by doing that, you can remind people that they haven't disappeared. But you're dealing with this image of Native Americans as a people that have, in effect, disappeared. And they haven't disappeared. They haven't disappeared.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering if you have any confidence in the legal system to modify behavior. Do the hate crime convictions that we just heard of this week help, or do you think that they make things worse?
Well, I think they help. Yeah. It is, well, first of all, laws are important. Because we're a nation of laws, right? We believe in the rule of law. Trust me when I tell you, you don't want to be in a country which doesn't have the rule of law. If you live in a country that just has the rule of men, we're talking about capriciousness, and a lack of accountability. Now, as I said earlier, we've had and continue to have and will have unjust laws, but you can change laws. Right? You can change laws. At some point, we want to be able to reconcile our laws, with justice. But they're not synonymous, right? But you want to be able to reconcile the two and things. And these laws are important because they protect us all. When they are good laws, they protect us all. Hate crimes are important because this of course comes into conflict with our notion of our right to free speech, right? And things. And often, we think we're allowed to, say anything we want. And it is clear, according to the laws that have been developed, that, you can't do that. You can't simply do things that, among other things, endanger people, right? So these laws are important and things. And there's been, in the Asian American community, a spate of hate crimes, often expressed in very violent ways. And Asian Americans, they want to be protected like other folks, right? So these laws are important, and we need to be involved in making sure that we have just laws. We need to have police who can enforce just laws. That's very important, very important. And it is, however, a back and forth struggle. Sometimes bad laws are made, then what are you going to do? You have to go and unmake the bad laws. It takes time. I realize that. And it does seem, unfair, but it's the system we have. And quite frankly, it's still the best system around. It's still the best system around. You have to deal with what we have, right? And things. Just remember, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The importance is persistence. You got to be persistent. You got to believe, in the rightness, of things and pursue it. And it's our responsibility as Americans. If you want this experiment to continue, you're going to have to be active. Be active. As teachers, you're already active in your classrooms, right? You're already active in your classrooms.
Yeah, Dr. Wei, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't ask you a little bit of question about I think it's your most recent book, the Becoming Colorado, the Centennial State and 100 Objects.
Yes.
And your thoughts on how that book reflects on your question of what it means to be an American. I think there's might have an interesting take on how that book might help answer that question.
Yes. Well, thank you, Keith, for asking that. Well, let me first of all point out that I wrote it in part as a history book of Colorado. For those of you who are familiar with the book, it contains 100 essays. And what it does is it shares the stories, of the objects, and how they have been part of the development of the Centennial State. And in learning about the Centennial State, you also then learn about how it's been part, if you will, of what I've referred to as the American experiment. It's part of American history. And it ends on an optimistic note. It talks about the problems. We have had a lot of dark chapters in the state, but I think, and I give reasons for why I think that we are on a, if you will, a hopeful trajectory. And I'd like to think that these essays are really quite accessible. Of course, they have great pictures. They have great pictures of these 100 objects. I saw in the chat that you can no longer take field trips, but by God, I hope you can at least go to the History Colorado and visit the exhibit, the zoom in exhibit, which features the 100 objects that are discussed in the book. I think by learning about Colorado through this book and others, you learn about, it's part of the American experience, about its part in the American project.
Yeah, and having had the several opportunities to go and visit that exhibit and spend some good time in there, I know great care was taken in telling the stories of as many of the cultures that make up Colorado, and I know, in United States, America. And so, and it's great that book is now kind of like a companion and digs in a little deeper with those essays. So,
yes.
So yeah, a good find. Thank you for writing it.
Thank you. And you can't leave that exhibit and you can't finish reading the book without realizing, that the state and by extension, the United States, consists of all kinds of folks. They have been part and parcel of what America's been about. And it's easier to relate to them on the local level and then go from there, to the national level, right? People tend to relate more to their neighborhood, and then they can see, yeah, that's right. I see how this works.
Are there additional questions or comments? Well, if you think of something, stop me, but don't forget to click your rate button and fill out the short survey to give us your feedback. Again, we'll send contact hours and the survey at the end of the week. There's a coupon attached to this talk that lets you purchase Dr. Wei's book at a 40% discount, which is a real bargain. And Crystal, are you going to pick a winner for the book pack giveaway?
I have. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The winner for the book pack is going to be Anne Maria DeMars. I will
Yeah,
send her an
good.
email, and she can, and we'll discuss about the books.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Wei. And we'll see you in the morning in Morning Mojo.
Take care, folks.
Thanks, Dr. Wei.
Have a great conference.
Thanks, Dr. Wei.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Stay warm. Stay safe.
Yes, you too.
Okay, we'll do.
You too.
I'll see
Thanks
you
for
all.
your words tonight.